Captain Jim Carter stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Phoenix, staring out into the cold vastness of space, his mind racing as a battle raged on around him, enemy fire streaking across the sky. Like deadly comets, he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. With every passing second, Xipherian warships loomed large ahead, and their numbers were overwhelming. But Jim was no ordinary commander. His reputation was built on impossible odds, and against all expectations, he was about to defy them once again. The Phoenix rocked violently as a blast struck its starboard side. But Jim didn't flinch, his eyes locked onto the holographic map. In front of him, the positions of enemy ships flashing red. He gave a sharp command, his voice steady, even in the chaos, full of confidence, as if he had already won the battle. In his mind, fire all forward cannons at maximum power. He ordered. The Phoenix was designed for speed and agility. It was a ship built for boldness, and Jim was about to use it to full effect. The crew moved swiftly, executing his orders with precision and discipline. The first volley of blasts erupted from the front of the ship, slamming into the lead Xipherian destroyer, its shields flaring, and then buckling under the intensity of the barrage. Jim smiled coldly as he watched the ship's hull begin to fracture, but he didn't waste time savoring the moment. Instead, he quickly issued another command: bring us around to the left flank before they can recover. He knew the Xipherians were formidable fighters, but they were also predictable. Their response would be a counterattack from the side, their weakest point. Jim had been studying their movements for days now. He knew exactly how they would react. It was all about timing and precision, and Jim had mastered both at that moment. The Phoenix executed a flawless evasive maneuver, sliding sideways between the debris of destroyed ships and firing from unexpected angles at the advancing Xipherian fleet. The Phoenix became a blur of motion, like a predator, darting in and out of the chaos, making it almost impossible for the enemy to target it. Their fire seemed to miss every time or strike harmlessly against its reinforced shields. Jim's mind raced as he directed the battle, every decision made in an instant, but each one calculated for maximum efficiency. He couldn't afford to fail, not today, not when humanity's survival depended on him. Suddenly, a transmission crackled through the communication line, and Jim froze for a brief moment. It wasn't a voice he recognized. It was too formal, cold, and detached, almost mechanical. It was coming from the Xipherian flagship, a voice he had heard of only in stories. King Orxar, the ruthless monarch of the Xipherian Empire. Jim's grip tightened on the armrest of his command chair as he listened to the message. This was not the standard protocol of war. This was something else altogether. The message was simple and chilling. Jim Carter, you'd have proven yourself a worthy adversary, and for that I extend an invitation to meet face to face. Come to Xipherian, and we will discuss the future of our people. I look forward to our meeting. The transmission cut off, leaving Jim staring at the blank screen, his heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and intrigue. He knew he had just been thrust into something far larger than the battle he was fighting. His instincts told him that this was not a mere offer for peace. This was something else entirely. But what could the Xipherian king possibly want from him? Jim thought about his crew, his fleet, and the human colonies they had just fought to protect, and for a moment he hesitated. It felt like walking into the heart of the unknown. But if there was one thing Jim Carter thrived on, it was the unknown. He straightened his posture and looked toward his executive officer. Now prepare the ship, we're going to Xipherian, he said as the tension in his chest grew even heavier. The journey to Xipherian was unlike any Jim had ever embarked on. The Phoenix cut through the darkness of space at full speed toward the heart of the Xipherian Empire. The silence on board was almost suffocating. The crew worked in tense, coordinated motions as they made preparations for what lay ahead. Jim couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap, but his instincts told him to proceed. The Xipherians were known for their cruelty, but also for their strategic mind games. If they wanted him dead, they would have made their move already. So this invitation, this strange offer, was something else entirely. Jim paced the bridge, his hands clasped behind his back. As the stars streaked past in the viewports outside, he could hear the faint hum of the engines beneath his feet, and feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on him with every passing moment. His mind wandered to the implications of the king's words, an invitation to meet face to face. What did that mean? Jim was no diplomat. He was a soldier, a leader forged in the heat of battle. But now he found himself in uncharted territory, not fighting an enemy with weapons, but something much more elusive, something that could change the course of galactic history. As the Phoenix approached the outskirts of Sci-Fi, Jim received a final transmission from the Zypharian fleet. A hologram flickered to life in front of him, and there stood the alien king, King Orxa himself, his features monstrous and imposing. His deep voice echoed in the cold emptiness of space. Jim Carter, I welcome you to Sci-Fi. I trust your journey has been comfortable, he said, his tone dripping with false warmth. Jim didn't respond right away. Instead, he observed the king's features. He knew this would be a psychological game. Orxa was trying to gauge his reaction, and Jim wasn't about to give him the satisfaction your offer is. Unexpected, Jim said, his voice steady though his mind churned. But I'm here to see what you want with me. Orxa's eyes narrowed, as if measuring the human before him. Very well, he said, and the transmission cut off. The Phoenix entered the atmosphere of Sci-Fi and landed on the king's private landing pad. Jim could feel the weight of the moment in the pit of his stomach. He wasn't sure what he expected, but this wasn't it. The ground beneath the Phoenix was pristine and sterile, a sharp contrast to the war-torn chaos of the battlefield that had brought him here. Jim disembarked with his most trusted officers by his side and was escorted by a contingent of Zypharian soldiers to a grand hall made entirely of shimmering metallic surfaces. The interior was as alien as it was beautiful, a world of cold elegance and calculated design. Jim's gaze flicked around the room, but his attention was drawn to the figure standing at the far end of the hall. It was her Princess Zara. Her fiery red hair contrasted sharply against the cold metal of her surroundings. Her expression was unreadable, but the defiance in her eyes was unmistakable. Jim's breath caught in his chest. But before he could react, King Orxa stepped forward, his voice deep and commanding. Captain Carter, I present to you my daughter, Princess Zara, a reward for your victory. She will be your companion in the days to come. Jim blinked as the words sank in Zara's eyes, locked with his, her gaze filled with bitterness and anger, a silent message of rebellion flowing between them. Jim had no words to offer in response. He had come expecting an alliance. But this was something far more complicated. Jim stood frozen, his mind racing, trying to process the enormity of what had just been laid before him. King Orxa's words hung in the air like a thick fog. He had expected something monumental, but not this, not the daughter of the very alien king he had just defeated at the cost of so many lives. The princess herself stood there defiant and proud, her posture rigid with contempt, her eyes burning with a fury that matched his own in some strange way. He understood that anger, it was the same fire that had fueled his victories, the same defiance he had felt when forced into impossible situations. But the weight of this new reality settled in his gut like a stone. What did he do with her? She was not a prize to be claimed or a tool to be used. She was a living, breathing person caught in the cruel machinations of a tyrant. Jim's mind flickered to his crew, his people, his fleet, and the world he had just left behind. This wasn't the victory he had anticipated. It wasn't the glory he had imagined. The room seemed to close in on him as the realization settled in. King Orxa spoke again, his voice deep and laced with the authority of a ruler who had seen centuries pass by. Captain Carter, I offer you a piece of my empire, a prize beyond your wildest dreams. He said, his words smooth and deliberate. It is a token of respect and a way to ensure peace between our peoples. I trust you will treat her with the honor she deserves. Jim felt the tension in his muscles tighten. He wanted to snap back, to demand an explanation, to question the king's intentions. But he held himself back, his gaze shifting from Orxa to Zara, who stood there silent, her fists clenched at her sides. Every inch of her radiated defiance. She would never submit to this arrangement. And he could see that the thought of being handed over like some sort of prize disgusted her. Jim looked away for a moment and then back to the king. Orxa seemed to be watching him carefully, as though trying to read his every reaction, perhaps gauging whether Jim would take the bait or refuse the twisted gift presented before him. Jim finally spoke, his voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of something deeper. "This isn't what I came for," he said, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "I came to end a war, not to take part in some political game." Orxa's face didn't shift. He simply stared down at Jim with an unreadable expression. "If that is your decision, then I respect it. But know this, my daughter will remain under my rule, and peace will be a distant hope between our worlds. You will find no other rewards in this galaxy as valuable as what I have given you," he said. There was a finality in his words. Jim felt the sting of the king's arrogance, but he didn't let it show. His mind raced as he processed the implications of this encounter. The Zypherian king wasn't simply offering a prize to Jim, he was making a statement, a move in a larger game, and Jim was suddenly thrust into the middle of it. But as his eyes returned to Zara, he saw something in her expression, a flicker of understanding, something deeper behind the rage she wore like armor. It was a silent challenge. She wasn't going to go quietly, she wasn't going to accept the king's rule, and neither would he. Jim took a step forward and nodded to Orxa. "I'll take her, but understand this, I will not be a pawn in your schemes." "And neither will she," he said. Orxa's smile didn't falter. "Very well," he replied, as the room seemed to pulse with tension. "But remember this, Carter, the game has only just begun, and there are more pieces at play than you can possibly imagine." Zara stepped forward, now her eyes locked on Jim for the first time, not with anger, but with something else, something unreadable, something that made the weight of the moment feel heavier than ever. Zara's gaze didn't leave Jim as she stepped forward, her movements sharp and deliberate, her defiance still apparent. But now there was something else in her eyes, something that Jim couldn't quite place. Was it distrust, or was it curiosity? She looked at him, as though she was sizing him up, as though he were the one who needed to be examined. And yet she said nothing. Her silence spoke volumes. Jim's heart pounded in his chest as the air thickened between them. For a moment, the entire room seemed to fade away. It was just him and Zara standing at the center of this strange new world that had been thrust upon them both in the same instant. Jim turned his focus back to King Orxa, who was watching them with an amused expression, clearly enjoying the discomfort that lingered in the air. Orxa spoke again, his voice laced with the calm authority of a ruler who had seen many situations unfold before him. "You may take her, but remember she is not a prize to be claimed or treated as a slave. I expect you to honor our agreement and show her the respect she deserves," he said. His words were an attempt at diplomacy, but Jim saw through it easily. Orxa was not concerned about respect, he was concerned about power and control. Jim nodded curtly and turned to Zara, who had yet to speak. Her eyes narrowed slightly as though waiting for him to make the next move. But Jim wasn't interested in playing her father's game. He wasn't interested in any of this. He had been thrust into a situation far beyond his understanding. But one thing was clear, he would not be manipulated, not by Orxa, and certainly not by Zara's fiery independence. He approached her slowly, no words between them, just the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts and emotions hanging in the air. Zara's gaze flicked from his face to the floor and back up again, the tension in her posture unmistakable. She was waiting for him to make his move, to assert his control over her. But Jim didn't flinch. He simply stood before her for a moment longer than was comfortable. His presence, not demanding but steady. Zara broke the silence. First, her voice sharp and challenging. "You think you can control me, don't you?" she said, her words like a whip cracking through the stillness. "I'm not some obedient soldier you can command." Jim held her gaze without backing down. "I don't want to control you," he said, his voice low and firm. "I don't want anything from you except to get through this alive." Zara's eyes narrowed further. She seemed to be searching for any sign of weakness, any indication that he would bow to her father's will. But Jim remained unfazed. He was a soldier, and he had faced far worse threats than this princess's scorn. Orxa's voice echoed from across the room, breaking the moment's intensity. "Jim Carter, you will treat my daughter with respect or suffer the consequences," he warned. The underlying threat was clear and unmistakable. Jim didn't acknowledge it. Instead, he simply turned to the exit, motioning for Zara to follow. Without a word, she stepped forward, her posture stiff and unwilling to surrender. But Jim didn't care. He wasn't here to fight for control. He was here to survive and protect humanity. That was his mission. Zora's defiance, her anger, her pride. They were all part of the game Orcsar was playing, but Jim would not play by his rules, not for a second. He walked out of the chamber with Zora at his side, the silence between them heavy and full of untold stories. They would have to learn to trust each other to survive the next battle that was certain. But for now, they would have to navigate this strange alliance and the treacherous game Orcsar had set in motion. The walk to the transport bay was a quiet one. Neither Jim nor Zora spoke. As they moved through the grand halls of the Zytharian palace, the weight of their silence was suffocating. Jim could feel Zora's eyes on him, her presence like a storm waiting to break. She was angry, and rightfully so. But Jim wasn't here to fight with her. He had his own battles to face. And she was part of this larger war. Whether she liked it or not, they reached the transport bay, where Jim's crew was waiting for him. His executive officer, Commander Daniels, approached with a look of confusion on his face. "Sir, what happened?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Jim ignored the question for a moment, instead glancing at Zora, who stood just behind him, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression cold and unyielding. Daniels followed his gaze and nodded grimly, understanding that something had shifted. But what Jim wasn't sure, he had no time to dwell on it, yet they needed to leave, and fast. There was no telling what Orcsar would do next. Jim turned back to Daniels. "We need to move out now," he said, his voice sharp as always. He glanced back at Zora, who was watching him with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. "Get on the ship now." Daniels gave a quick nod and began issuing orders to the crew. Zora hesitated for a moment, then followed Jim onto the transport ship, her movements stiff and reluctant. Jim didn't look at her as she took her seat across the room, but he could feel her gaze burning into his back. The ship hummed to life as it began to ascend from the Zytharian capital planet, leaving the gleaming spires of the palace behind them. They were heading to the outskirts of the galaxy, where humanity's colony worlds were located. Jim knew this was only the beginning of whatever game Orcsar had planned. But he had no intention of playing by the king's rules, not if he could help it. As the ship entered the vastness of space, Jim leaned back in his seat and took a deep breath, his thoughts drifting back to the battle that had brought him here. The Zytharians had been a powerful enemy, but they were also predictable. Their strength was their military might, their advanced technology. But Jim knew something they didn't. He knew how to win against the odds, how to outthink and outmaneuver them. And that was his advantage. Zora was still watching him. He could feel her eyes on him. Despite the silence between them, her defiance was palpable, her presence a constant reminder that he had not come out of this unscathed. But he wasn't here to take part in her father's twisted schemes. And that was something she had yet to understand. She hadn't seen what he had seen, the sacrifices he had made, the people he had lost in the name of survival. She didn't know what it was like to be a soldier at the front lines, fighting for every breath of air she took. But he was beginning to realize that she was more than just a princess to be used in some galactic game. She was a person, and her anger, her bitterness, her rebellion, they were all part of her story. Jim looked across the room at her, finally meeting her gaze. "What's your plan?" he asked, his voice steady. Despite the tension in the air, she narrowed her eyes and leaned forward slightly. "My plan," she said with a sneer, "is to get as far from you as possible and return to my people, to take back what's mine, to make sure my father never has control again." Jim wasn't sure whether to admire her determination or to be wary of her recklessness. He couldn't deny that she had courage, but courage wasn't always enough in a galaxy like this. Sometimes it took more than defiance. Sometimes it took the strength to make hard choices. "Zora, your father is playing a dangerous game," he said, his voice lowering. "It's not just about you or me. It's about the future of both our people. Orcsar doesn't care about either of us. He's using us as pawns in a war that could tear this galaxy apart." Zora's eyes softened for the briefest of moments, but the hard edge in her expression didn't falter. She was a royal to her core, and no amount of common sense would change that quickly. If ever. Jim sighed and turned his gaze to the viewports outside. The stars stretched out before them, an endless sea of possibilities. He knew they had no choice but to work together if they were going to survive what was coming. But getting Zora to see that would be another battle entirely. The ship hummed through the blackness of space, its engines a steady pulse beneath Jim's feet. As the stars streaked past them at light speed, the silence between him and Zara persisted like a thick wall, neither of them willing to break it just yet. Jim had a lot on his mind: the Zypharian conspiracy, the strange alliance he had been thrust into, the sudden responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders. But Zara's presence lingered in the back of his thoughts. She was still the wild card in this entire situation. And Jim knew that no matter how much he tried to distance himself from her, reality had a way of pulling them together. She was a princess trapped in a royal game, one that she didn't want to play. And he was a soldier bound by duty to protect his people. But what would they do when that duty led them down the same dark path? Jim didn't have the answers, but he had to find them. Soon the ship dropped out of hyperspace with a jolt, and the hum of the engines quieted for a moment as they entered the outskirts of human-controlled space. The colony worlds lay just ahead, a cluster of planets where humanity had carved out a fragile existence amidst the chaos of the galaxy. Jim turned to look at Zara, who had remained silent for the entire journey, her eyes fixed on the stars outside, as if contemplating something far deeper than the events of the last few days. "Zara, we need to talk," he said, his voice low and direct. Zara didn't turn to look at him. She kept her eyes fixed ahead, the silence dragging on between them. She was stubborn, and Jim couldn't blame her for it. She had every reason to distrust him and humanity, but they both knew that this wasn't something that could be ignored any longer. She might hate him for what had happened, but they both had to figure out how to survive whatever Orksar had set in motion. Zara finally spoke, her voice soft yet laced with bitterness. "Do you think you can change things?" she asked, her tone almost a challenge. She turned to him, her eyes cold with suspicion. "Do you think you can make me play by your rules?" she said, her words almost daring him to respond. Jim met her gaze head-on. He knew this was coming. He had seen it before, the defiant princess who believed she could carve her own path, no matter the cost. "I'm not asking you to play by my rules," he said, his voice steady. "I'm asking you to understand that this isn't just about you or me anymore. This is bigger than either of us. Orksar is playing a game where we're both pawns, whether we like it or not. And if we don't start thinking beyond our own desires, we're going to lose everything." She studied him for a long moment, as though trying to gauge whether he meant what he said, whether he was just trying to manipulate her like so many others before him. But for the first time, Jim saw something in her eyes, a flicker of doubt, perhaps a crack in the armor she had built around herself. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to realize that he wasn't her enemy, but her unlikely ally. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the stars, the silent battle between them still raging. Jim sighed and turned to look out the viewports too. There was no easy solution to this, nothing he could say that would instantly change her mind or win her trust. But he knew one thing for certain: they couldn't keep fighting each other. Not if they were going to stand any chance against Orksar's empire together. They would have to find common ground. And that was going to be harder than any battle Jim had ever fought. But it was the only choice they had. Suddenly a voice interrupted the moment. Commander Daniel's voice crackled through the comms. "Captain, we've just received a transmission from the Zypharian fleet. It's urgent." Jim stood up and motioned for Zara to follow him. Without a word, he moved toward the command deck, the tension between them still palpable. But now there was an urgency in the air. The ship's crew was already at their stations as they received the incoming message. Jim stepped into the command chair and looked up at the screen. The face that appeared was familiar, but not one he had hoped to see. It was Orksar, his massive form looming large on the screen, his eyes cold and calculating. "Captain Carter, it seems our little game has just begun." Orksar's voice echoed across the bridge, his tone carrying a hidden threat. But it wasn't the words that worried Jim, it was the way Orksar was smiling, as if he already knew what move he was about to make next. Orksar's smile twisted like a predator, savoring the moment. Jim could feel the weight of the king's gaze through the screen. It was as if the Zypharian ruler was already toying with him, testing his resolve, testing how far he could push. Before Jim cracked, Jim stayed silent for a moment, watching Orksar carefully. The Zypharian king was a master of manipulation, and Jim knew it. But Jim wasn't here to be intimidated. He wasn't here to play Orksar's game. "What do you want, Orksar?" Jim finally asked, his voice calm but steady, his eyes locked on the king's image. I thought we had settled our little arrangement." Orxa's smile didn't fade as he leaned forward slightly, his eyes glimmering with a cold satisfaction. "Captain Carter, I was merely making sure my daughter arrived safely to your ship. But I've had a change of heart," he said, his tone almost playful, like a cat toying with a mouse. Jim's blood ran cold. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice tight. Orxa chuckled softly, not out of humor, but more out of cruel amusement. "It means, Captain, that this little game of yours is far from over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You see, I've realized something. You and I are not so different. After all, both of us are warriors caught in a web of forces beyond our control. Both of us have people we must protect, people we care about. Both of us know the cost of war, the sacrifices that must be made. But here's the difference, Carter." He paused, as if savoring the words. "I can afford to lose. I can lose soldiers, fleets, entire worlds. But you cannot. You have no choice but to play by my rules now. Because the moment you defy me completely, you will lose everything." Jim's chest tightened at the cold truth in Orxa's words. He didn't want to admit it, but Orxa was right. Jim had already seen the destruction that Sci-Fians were capable of, and they wouldn't hesitate to wipe out entire colonies just to make a point if it came to that. Zara's gaze flicked to Jim as the conversation unfolded. She said nothing, but Jim could feel the heat of her anger burning even though her lips remained shut. Her father's words were like a slap to her face. She wasn't a tool to be used. She wasn't some prize to be given away. Yet here she was caught in the middle of her father's power plays and Jim's own struggle to keep humanity safe. But what Orxa said hit Jim harder than anything he'd expected. If they weren't careful, they'd both be trapped in this war with no way out. He clenched his jaw, but remained silent for a moment, taking in the weight of what was being said. Jim finally spoke again, his voice cold but defiant. "Then we're at an impasse," he said. "If you want to play games with me, Orxa, fine. But don't think for a second I'll bow to your will. I will not be a pawn in your empire. I'll fight back if I have to. And I'll take down anyone who stands in my way, including you." Orxa's eyes darkened slightly, but his smile never faltered. He was enjoying this. Jim could see that. But Jim wasn't about to let the king have the last word. "You can't win this war by breaking people down piece by piece, Orxa." Jim set his tone steady, fierce. "You can't keep playing us against each other forever. Zara is not a weapon for you to wield. She's not a bargaining chip for you to throw into the fire." Orxa's expression hardened slightly, and for the first time, Jim saw something flicker behind his eyes, the briefest moment of anger. But it was gone as quickly as it had come, and Orxa's smile returned with renewed intensity. "You have much to learn, Captain Carter," he said. "And as for my daughter, well, we shall see how long you can keep her on your side. She will make her own choices, just as you will make yours." Jim clenched his fists at his sides and took a deep breath. He knew what Orxa was trying to do. He was sowing doubt. He was trying to create division between them. Zara was already caught in the web of her father's control, and Jim had no intention of letting Orxa manipulate their relationship any further. But Orxa wasn't finished. Yet one final message echoed through the comms before the transmission ended. "Captain Carter, remember this, you're playing my game now, and in my game the stakes are always higher than you think. Good luck," he said. And then the screen went dark. Jim stared at the empty screen for a long moment, feeling the weight of Orxa's words like a heavy stone lodged in his chest. His fingers tightened on the armrest of his command chair, and he stood slowly looking to Zara, who was standing silently by the bridge doors, her gaze unreadable. But Jim could sense the internal conflict within her. He could feel the turmoil in the way she held herself, as if everything within her was screaming to break free from her father's grasp. But at the same time, she was trapped between loyalty to her people and the brutal reality of the game Orxa was playing. They both were trapped in this twisted dance, and the only way out was through survival. The tension in the air was suffocating as Jim turned from the now silent screen and locked eyes with Zara. She hadn't moved an inch since the transmission ended. Her arms were still crossed tightly over her chest, her expression still unreadable. But the defiance in her eyes remained as fierce as ever. Jim could feel the weight of Orxa's words still lingering in the room. They were playing a dangerous game, one that had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than either of them could fully comprehend. He knew the Sci-Fian king wasn't going to stop playing with them, but easily the offer of peace had been a lie, a thin veneer over the king's true intentions. And Zara was a piece in his game, a piece he intended to use to his advantage, but Jim wasn't about to let her be another casualty in a war that was far from over. Zara finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "You think you can protect me?" She asked, her words sharp with frustration, her gaze never leaving his face. "You think you can keep me safe from him?" Jim took a step closer to her, his voice steady. "Zara, I'm not here to protect you," he said, his eyes meeting hers with the same intensity. "I'm here to make sure neither of us ends up playing by Oxa's rules, not when we have the chance to change things." Zora's eyes flickered with something resembling surprise, but she quickly masked it behind a cold veneer. "You talk about changing things, like it's that simple," she said, her tone almost bitter. "And you think I haven't tried?" She shook her head in frustration, her voice rising a little. "I've spent my whole life in this cage. Jim, I've spent my entire life fighting against my father's rule, and nothing has ever changed, so forgive me if I'm skeptical about some soldier coming in and saving the day." Zara, Jim's voice softened, but it was firm. "Listen to me," he said, "we're both trapped in a game that we didn't choose, and right now we have a chance to break free. But it's not going to be easy, you're right, it's not simple. But we can't keep fighting each other and pretending we have the luxury of time. Oxal won't give us that time. He'll burn everything to the ground before he lets either of us defy him. But we're not helpless in this fight. We still have choices, and we still have the power to make a difference." Zara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze turning toward the floor, as if considering his words. She looked lost for a moment, almost vulnerable, and Jim saw it, the flicker of doubt, the tiny crack in her armor. But it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. She straightened up again, her defiance returning. She wasn't ready to give in yet, and Jim knew she wouldn't be, not yet. But he could see that there was something in her slowly shifting. It wasn't trust, but it was the beginning of something else. She was starting to see that perhaps they weren't so different. After all, Jim didn't press her further. Instead, he turned to face the crew who had been watching the exchange in silence. "Commander Daniels, Captain, we've picked up something on the long-range sensors," he said, his voice grave. "A fleet has appeared on the edge of our system. It's the Zypharian fleet." Jim's heart skipped a beat, and he looked up at the tactical display, the red dots indicating the enemy ships were growing larger by the second. "We can't outrun them," he said, his voice hard and commanding. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers." Daniels nodded and moved to his post, the crew quickly falling into action. Jim's mind raced. He knew they couldn't outrun Orxa's fleet, and a fight with them was the last thing they needed. They were too deep in Zypharian territory, and Orxal was nothing if not persistent. If they didn't act fast, they'd be trapped, and Orxal would have them right where he wanted them. He turned to Zara, who was still standing at the edge of the bridge, staring at the viewports, a cold fire in her eyes. "If we're going to survive this, Zara," he said, his voice low, "we need to work together. No more games, no more trying to outplay each other. We need to trust each other. For once we need to make this work. You think I don't know that." She snapped, her voice sharp, but her eyes held something else, determination. She finally turned to face him fully, and for the first time since their tense exchange, she didn't look away. "I won't let my father win," she said with quiet resolve. "Whatever it takes, we do it together." Jim nodded, his expression steady. Together they had a chance, but apart they would fall like pawns in Orxa's grand game. The stakes were higher than either of them could have imagined, and the road ahead would be fraught with danger. But for the first time since they met, Jim believed they stood a chance. He turned back to the crew and nodded to Daniels. "Prepare for battle," he ordered. "But we're not just fighting for survival anymore, we're fighting to win." The ship shuddered as the alarms blared, signaling the arrival of the Zypharian fleet, the red dots on the tactical display now filling up the screen. Jim's heart raced, but his mind was sharp and focused. This wasn't the time to panic. This was the moment where every decision mattered. The crew was moving with purpose, Daniels barking orders as the ship swerved and dodged incoming fire. Zara stood next to Jim, her posture tense, but her eyes no longer filled with distrust. Instead, they held something stronger, resolve. They had come to an unspoken understanding. They were in this together now. And that made all the difference. Zara turned to him, her voice low but fierce. "What's the plan?" she asked, her gaze never leaving the viewports. As the enemy fleet grew closer, Jim glanced at the map, showing their trajectory. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had the advantage of speed and maneuverability. The Zypharians were a force to be reckoned with, But Jim wasn't about to let them have their way so easily. "The first move is to break formation," he said, his voice firm. "We can't fight them head-on, but we can outmaneuver them, Daniels. Initiate evasive maneuvers and engage the defense systems." Jim turned to Zara. "You're going to have to trust me on this. We need to get close enough to their command ship to disable their communication systems. If we take out their coordination, we can scatter their forces and make our escape." Zara hesitated for a moment, her eyes flashing with uncertainty. But then she nodded, her jaw clenched tightly. "I trust you," she said simply, and for the first time since they had met, Jim felt a shift between them. It wasn't trust in the way soldiers trusted their comrades. It was something else, a shared understanding born from the chaos they were facing together. Jim turned back to the viewports as the first wave of enemy fire came crashing toward them, his hands gripping the armrest of his command chair. The ship rocked under the impact. But they kept moving. They had to keep moving. Daniels shouted orders from a helm, and the ship veered sharply to the left. The Zytharians were closing in. But they were slower than Jim had anticipated. Their ships were powerful, but they lacked the agility of his smaller vessel. The maneuverability was their advantage, and Jim wasn't about to let it slip away. As the ship weaved through the incoming fire, Jim's eyes locked onto the flagship of the Zytharian fleet. It was a massive vessel, the heart of their power, and the key to everything. If they could disable its communications, they would win the battle without firing another shot. Jim's voice cut through the chaos. "Now, Daniels, get us close enough. Zara, get ready to move out." Zara's eyes flashed with intensity. She was ready. She had been ready for this moment since they first locked eyes on each other back in the Zytharian palace. No more hesitation, no more doubt. She moved swiftly toward the hatch that led to the ship's exit bay, her face set in determination. Jim didn't take his eyes off the viewports, but he could feel her presence behind him. The tension between them had shifted into something sharper, something more focused. It wasn't about what had happened before anymore. It was about the mission and the future. Zara didn't need to be told twice. She was already suited up and ready to go, her movements quick and precise. She knew what was at stake. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and neither of them could afford to fail. Jim's voice was firm now as he watched the distance between them and the Zytharian flagship close. "Daniels, take us in closer. We're almost there," he said, his pulse quickening. As they neared the enemy ship, Zara would have only one shot to disable the communications. And once they did, Jim knew they would have to move fast. No hesitation, just action. The ship surged forward as the massive Zytharian flagship loomed large on the viewports. Jim felt the adrenaline flood his veins. He had done this 100 times before, fought against impossible odds, and found a way to survive. But this time it was different. He wasn't alone. Zara had become part of this fight, whether she liked it or not, and together they would make a stand against the Empire that sought to crush them all. Daniels shouted again. "Now, Captain, the ship is in range." Jim's heart beat loudly in his chest, but his voice was calm. "Activate the stealth mode," he ordered Zara. "Once we disable their communications, we make our escape. We do this fast and clean. There's no room for mistakes." Zara's eyes were steely, but her focus never wavered. She gave him a sharp nod and moved quickly to the airlock door. Jim's breath was steady, his eyes locked onto the enemy ship. Their plan was simple: strike, fast, disable their systems, and vanish before the Zytharians could regroup. Jim knew the risks, but there was no other option. They were playing for everything now. With a final command, Jim watched as Zara's figure disappeared through the airlock into the depths of the mission ahead. The tension was unbearable, but it was also clear Zara was more than capable. This was no longer about Orxa's twisted game or his manipulations. It was about survival. It was about taking control of their fates. And for the first time since their journey began, Jim believed they could win the battle ahead. The ship's engines roared as Jim's eyes never left the viewport, watching as Zara's figure disappeared into the airlock. The silence on the bridge was deafening. The only sound, the hum of the ship's systems and the distant beeping of the alarms as the Zytharian fleet closed in. His hands tightened around the armrests, and he couldn't help but wonder if he had underestimated Zara's resolve. She had made a choice to stand beside him, and now the weight of that decision would shape everything. He had no room for error. Daniels, his first officer, gave him a brief nod as he expertly maneuvered the ship around incoming fire, keeping them just out of range of the enemy's more powerful weapons. The crew was moving with a synchronized efficiency. the years of battle-tested discipline coming to the forefront. But despite the controlled chaos unfolding on the bridge, Jim's mind was elsewhere, focused on the lone figure making her way through the enemy's deadly web. Zara's task was dangerous. Infiltrating a flagship was no small feat, especially one with as much firepower as the Zypherian command ship. But Jim knew that Zara was no ordinary person. She was the daughter of Orksar, the rebellious princess, and that made her more dangerous than anything Orksar had planned. She knew how to move through hostile environments, how to strike quickly and disappear before the enemy even realized what had happened. Jim trusted her, and for the first time, he realized that perhaps she trusted him too. Minutes felt like hours as Jim monitored the bridge, keeping one eye on the ship's systems and the other on the countdown timer that marked their narrow window of opportunity. It was a dangerous game they were playing, but it was the only chance they had. Then the communication system blared to life. The voice was unmistakable. "Carter, you are playing a very dangerous game." Orksar's voice echoed through the speakers, cold and calculating. His mocking tone made Jim's blood boil. He knew Orksar had been watching their every move, enjoying the tension he was creating. The king didn't think they would make it this far. "Do you really think you can escape the Zypherian Empire? You're making a fool's choice, and it will cost you dearly." Jim didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at the screen, his jaw clenched tight. Orksar's arrogance had always been his weakness. The Zypherian king assumed that by making threats and using his daughter as a pawn, he could control everyone. But Jim had learned something over the years. The more you pushed someone, the more you exposed your own vulnerabilities. And right now, Orksar was exposing his. "Orksar," Jim finally said, his voice cold and controlled. "You've made a fatal mistake. You think I'm afraid of your threats, but it's you who should be worried. We'll break your hold, and I'll make sure you never get your hands on anyone again." There was a pause before Orksar's laughter echoed through the comms. "We'll see how long that resolve lasts, Carter. Once my fleet has you cornered, you'll regret defying me." The transmission cut off abruptly, and Jim turned his attention back to the battle. Time was running out. "Daniels, how much longer until Zara reaches the communications array?" Jim asked, his eyes narrowing as he watched the approaching enemy ships. "Not long, sir," Daniels replied, his voice unwavering. "She'll be there in 2 minutes, tops. But the closer she gets, the more dangerous it becomes. The flagship is bristling with defenses." Jim nodded. He knew what that meant. Zara was up against everything Orksar's empire had to offer, and the risk of failure was immense. But he had no choice but to trust her. A sudden jolt rocked the ship, and the alarms blared again as a hail of fire from the Zypherian fleet struck the shields. The ship lurched violently, but Daniels expertly adjusted the ship's trajectory, weaving them through the incoming fire. The hull groaned under the impact, but the shields held steady. "Sir, we've got a direct hit to the aft section," Daniels reported, but there was no panic in his voice. "We've lost some power to the aft engines, but it's not critical." "Good," Jim said, his eyes scanning the bridge. "Stay with it. Keep us moving." For the next few moments, the tension on the bridge was palpable. Jim watched as Zara's progress was relayed on the display. Her status was updated in real time. She was close, very close. Then, just as the enemy ships began to close in from all sides, a red light flashed across the tactical screen. The communication array on the Zypherian flagship had been disabled. "Zara did it," Daniels exclaimed. Jim's heart skipped a beat. "Good. Now get us out of here." With the flagship's communications severed, the Zypherian fleet lost its coordination. Their movements became disorganized, their ships scattering as they tried to make sense of the sudden loss of command. But the opening was brief. Jim knew that if they didn't make their escape now, Orksar would find a way to regroup and come after them with even more force. "Daniels, get us to the edge of the system. Full speed ahead," Jim ordered. The ship lurched forward, and they shot through the battlefield like a streak of lightning. The Zypharian ships were still scrambling, trying to regain order, but they were too slow. The battlefield was chaos, and Jim's crew knew how to exploit that chaos. For a brief moment, Jim allowed himself to breathe. They had done it. They had made it. They were free. But as he looked to Zara's empty seat, his thoughts returned to what lay ahead. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. And with Orksar still out there, they would have to keep fighting together. Zara returned moments later, her expression unreadable, but her eyes betraying the weight of the mission she had just completed. She didn't say a word, but her presence spoke volumes. Jim knew that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The war wasn't over, but together they had a chance to shape the future. And for the first time, Jim felt that maybe, just maybe, they could win.